Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com.
Episode 49, The American Civil War, Part 6. The most notable byproduct of war is scar tissue. This takes many forms, from psychological to actual scarring of the landscape. As the war closed, Americans saw a transformed America, one that had been marred by railroads that careened over the landscape like fresh sutures, created to help move the war machines and supply troops. Settlers began to homestead out west, carving the land into small parcels. The country redrew state lines and even the creation of a new state of West Virginia in the wake of the secession. The divide of the Mason-Dixon line further split the country as the South came to terms with the North's boot heel, crushing it into submission. The psychological wounds echo today, haunting the South. Lincoln's wartime reliance on the telegraph ultimately led to a wave of investment in new communication machines. Lines quickly found themselves jutting out of the American landscape. The Democratic and Republican parties endured the war and have held their places as the dominant U.S. political parties ever since. We still feel the political quagmire and tribalism to this every day. War journalists are still very prevalent to this day. Reporters dispatched eyewitness accounts by soldiers via telegraph to the country's 2,500 newspapers, printed almost instantly, and then read voraciously by citizens frantic to know how the war was shaping up. The war was the first war in which people at home could absorb the battle within a short time. The first Memorial Days were group events arranged in 1865 in both the South and North, just a month after the war ended. Quickly developing into an annual ritual, these decoration days were usually set up for early summer, when the most flowers would be available to lay on tombstones. Decoration days helped the torn nation heal from its wounds. People retold their war stories, celebrated accomplishments of local heroes, and reconciled with one-time adversaries. When I take a step back and recognize the Civil War, all I see are phantoms that still torment us to this very day. Sherman's March to the Sea. From November 15 until December 21, 1864, Union General William T. Sherman led some 60,000 soldiers on a 285-mile march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. Sherman's march to the sea sought to shock Georgia's civilian population into leaving the Confederate cause. Sherman's soldiers did not demolish any of the towns in their path, but they stole food and livestock and torched the houses and barns of people who tried to fight back. The Yankees were, quote, not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, Sherman explained. Consequently, they sought to make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. General Sherman's troops seized Atlanta on September 2, 1864. This was a notable victory because Atlanta was a railroad hub and the industrial center of the Confederacy. It had munitions factories, foundries, and warehouses that kept the Confederate Army equipped with food, weapons, and other goods. It stood between the Union Army and two of its most precious targets, the Gulf of Mexico to the west and Charleston to the east. It was also a sign of Confederate pride and strength, and its fall made even the most loyal Southerners question whether they could win the war. After relinquishing Atlanta, the Confederate Army headed west into Tennessee and Alabama, striking Union supply lines as they went. However, Sherman was hesitant to set off on a wild goose chase across the South, so he split his troops into two groups. Major General George Thomas took some 60,000 men to meet the Confederates in Nashville, In contrast, Sherman took the remaining 62,000 on an offensive march through Georgia to Savannah, smashing things to the sea. Sherman thought the Confederacy stemmed its power, not from its fighting force, but from compassionate Southern whites' material and moral support. He maintained that factories, farms, and railroads supplied Confederate troops with the needed things. If he could destroy those things, the Confederate war effort would crumble. Meanwhile, his troops could damage Southern morale by making life so distasteful for Georgia civilians that they would demand an end to the war. To that end, Sherman's troops marched south toward Savannah in two wings, about 30 miles apart. On November 22, 3,500 Confederate cavalry started a scuffle with the Union soldiers at Griswoldville, but that ended badly. 650 Confederate soldiers were killed or wounded, compared to 62 Union casualties. Southern troops began no more battles. Instead, they fled south ahead of Sherman's troops, wreaking havoc as they went. They destroyed bridges, chopped down trees, and burned barns filled with provisions before the Union army could reach them. The Union soldiers were just as unsparing. They plundered farms and plantations, stealing and butchering cows, chickens, turkeys, sheep, and hogs, and taking as much other food, specifically bread and potatoes, as they could carry. These groups of foraging soldiers were nicknamed bummers. They burned whatever they could not take. The ravaging Yankees required the supplies, but they also wanted to teach Georgians a lesson. Quote, "It isn't so sweet to secede," one soldier wrote in a letter home, as they thought it would be. Sherman's troops reached Savannah on December 21, 1864, about 3 weeks after leaving Atlanta. The city was unprotected when they got there. Sherman offered the city of Savannah 25,000 bales of cotton to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. Early in 1865, Sherman and his men left Savannah, looting and torturing their way through South Carolina to Charleston. In April, the Confederacy relinquished, and the war was over. Sherman's total war in Georgia was fierce and damaging. Still, it did just what it was supposed to do. It hurt Southern enthusiasm, made it inconceivable for the Confederates to fight at total capacity, and likely hastened the war's end. The march to the sea was overwhelming to Georgia and the Confederacy. Sherman calculated that the campaign had inflicted about $1.6 billion in destruction, about one-fifth of which was injured to their advantage. At the same time, the remainder is simple waste and destruction. The army wrecked 300 miles of railroad, numerous bridges, and miles of telegraph lines. It seized 5,000 horses, 4,000 mules, and 13,000 head of cattle. It confiscated 9.5 million pounds of corn and 10.5 million pounds of fodder, and destroyed innumerable cotton gins and mills. The campaign's notable damage to railroads and southern logistics struck the Confederate war effort to pieces. Sherman had completed a fantastic job. He had disregarded military principles by operating deep within enemy territory and without lines of supply or communication. He destroyed much of the South's potential and psychology to wage war. The capital defacement caused by the march led to a substantial contraction in agricultural investment, farming asset prices, and manufacturing activity. Elements of the reduction in agriculture endured through 1920. Ironclads. An ironclad is a steam-propelled warship shielded by iron or steel armor plates, assembled from 1859 to the early 1890s. The ironclad was developed due to the susceptibility of wooden ships to explosive or incendiary shells. The first ironclad warship, the Galore, was launched by the French Navy in November 1859, just preempting the British Royal Navy. After the first clashes of ironclads, both with wooden ships and with one another, took place in 1862 during the American Civil War, it became clear that the ironclad had superseded the unarmored ship of the line as the most mighty warship afloat. Ironclad gunboats came to be very successful in the American Civil War. Ironclads were created for several roles, including high-speed battleships, long-range cruisers, and coastal defense ships. The rapid growth of warships design in the late 19th century changed the ironclad from a wooden-hulled vessel that carried sails to supplement its steam engines into the steam-built, turreted battleships and cruisers familiar in the 20th century. This change was moved forward by the evolution of heavier naval guns, more sophisticated steam engines, and advancements in metallurgy which made ship steel building conceivable. The quick pace of change meant that many ships were outdated almost as soon as they were completed, and those naval tactics were in flux. Builders built many ironclads to use the ram, the torpedo, or sometimes both, which several maritime engineers believed were the essential weapons of naval combat. There is no clear end to the ironclad period, but towards the end of the 1890s, the term ironclad fell out of use. New ships were increasingly constructed to a standard pattern and designated battleships or armored cruisers. The first use of ironclads in action came in the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Navy at the time of the war broke out had no ironclads, its most potent ships being 6 unarmored steam-powered frigates. Since the bulk of the Navy remained loyal to the Union, the Confederacy sought to gain an advantage in the naval conflict by acquiring modern armored ships. In May 1861, the Confederate Congress appropriated $2 million for the purchase of ironclads from overseas, and in July and August 1861, the Confederacy started work on construction and converting wooden ships. On the 12th of October in 1861, the CSS Manassas became the first ironclad to enter combat when she fought Union warships on the Mississippi during the Battle of Head of Passes. She had been converted from a commercial vessel in New Orleans for river and coastal fighting. In February 1862, the most prominent CSS Virginia joined the Confederate Navy, having been rebuilt in Norfolk. Constructed on the hull of a USS Merrimack, Virginia originally was a conventional warship made of wood, but she was converted into an iron-covered casemate, ironclad gunship when she entered the Confederate Navy. By this time, the Union had completed 7 ironclad gunboats of the same city class. The Union also built a sizable armored frigate, the USS New Ironsides, and the smaller USS Galena. It was about to end the USS Monitor, an innovative design proposed by Swedish inventor John Ericsson. The first battle between ironclads happened on the 9th of March, 1862, as the North deployed the Armored Monitor to protect the Union's wooden fleet from the ironclad ram Virginia and other Confederate warships. In this engagement, on the second day of the Battle of Hampton Road, the two ironclads repeatedly tried to ram one another while shells bounced off their armor. The battle attracted attention worldwide, making it clear that wooden warships were now out of date, and the ironclads destroying them very quickly. The Civil War saw more ironclads built by both sides, and they played an increasing role in the naval war alongside the unarmored warships, commerce raiders, and blockade runners. The Union made a large fleet of 50 monitors modeled on their namesake. The Confederacy built ships designed as smaller versions of Virginia, many of which saw action. Still, their attempts to buy ironclads overseas were frustrated as European nations confiscated vessels built for the Confederacy, especially in Russia, the only country to openly support the Union through the war. Only CSS Stonewall was completed, and she arrived in American waters just before the war ended. Through the remainder of the war, ironclads saw action in the Union's attack on Confederate ports. For the latest episode of Mobile Bay, the Union assembled 4 monitors as well as 11 wooden ships facing the CSS Tennessee, the Confederacy's most powerful ironclad, and the gunboats CSS Morgan, CSS Gaines, and CSS Selma. 7 Union monitors, including the USS Montauk, 2 other ironclads, and the ironclad frigate New Ironsides, and a light draft USS Keokuk participated in the failed attack in Charleston. 1 was sunk. 2 small ironclads, the CSS Palmetto State and the CSS Chicora, participated in the harbor's defense. On the Western Front, the Union built a problematic force of river ironclads, beginning with several converted riverboats and then contracting engineers James Eade of St. Louis, Missouri, to build the city-class ironclads. Builders built these excellent ships with twin engines and a central paddle wheel, all protected by an armor casement. They had a shallow draft, which allowed them to journey up smaller tributaries and were well suited for river operations. Eads also produced monitors for the use on the rivers, the first two of which differed from the ocean-going monitors in that they incorporated a paddle wheel. The Union ironclads played an integral role in Mississippi and tributaries by providing enormous fire upon Confederate forts, installations, and vessels with relative impunity to enemy fire. They were not as heavily armored as the ocean-going monitors of the Union, but they were acceptable for their intended use. Torpedoes sank more Western Flotilla Union ironclads than enemy fire, and the most damaging fire for the Union ironclads was from shore installations, not Confederate vessels. Piracy, Part 4. The Confederate privateers were privately owned ships sanctioned by the government of the Confederate States of America to strike the shipping of the United States. Although the appeal was to profit by seizing merchant vessels and seizing their cargoes, the government was most interested in shifting the efforts of the Union Navy away from the blockade of southern ports and perhaps motivating European intervention in the conflict. At the beginning of the American Civil War, the Confederate government sought to counter the United States Navy by appealing to private businesses worldwide to engage in privateering against the United States shipping. Privateering was a practice of fitting ordinary private merchant vessels with modest armament, then sending them to the sea to capture other merchant vessels in return for monetary reward. The seized ships and cargo fell under customary prize rules at sea. Pirates would take prizes to the jurisdiction of a competent court, which could be in the sponsoring country or theoretically in any neutral port. If the court found the capture was legal, the ship and cargo would be relinquished and sold as a prize auction. According to the contractual arrangement, the profits would then be dispersed among owners and crew. Privateers were also permitted to attack an enemy's naval ship, when then applied to the sponsoring government for direct financial reward, usually gold or gold coin. In the early days of the war, the morale of the Confederacy was high, and many ship owners reacted to the appeal by applying for letters of marque. Not all those who gained approval went to sea, but the number of pirates was high enough to be a considerable concern for U.S. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles. They shifted many ships of the Union Navy from blockade duty to capture pirates. Most pirates managed to remain free, but officials caught enough that the owners and crew had to consider the risk earnestly. The capture of the privateers Savannah and Jefferson Davis resulted in important court cases that did much to define the nature of the Civil War itself. Pirates could not maintain their initial spirit. Privateers found it challenging to deliver their captures to Confederate courts, so they realized the expected profits. By the end of the first year of the war, the risk of far surpassed the benefits in the minds of the most owners and crews. The practice continued only sporadically through the rest of the war as the Confederate government turned its efforts against northern trade to commission Confederate Navy commerce raiders such as the CSS Alabama and the CSS Florida. The Civil War was the last time a hostile power seriously resorted to privateering. The Declaration of Paris had already banned the practice. Following the Civil War, the United States agreed to abide by the Declaration of Paris. Regardless, more important than any international agreement is that the increased cost and complexity of naval weaponry effectively dismissed any suitable prospects for profit for private enterprise maritime warfare. President Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, ordered the blockading squadron to secure the primary privateering ports of the South, which was accomplished quickly by joint Army-Navy actions against Forts Hatteras and Clark by the bay to the Sounds in North Carolina, Forts Beauregard and Walker at Port Royal Sound, and the Ship Islands near New Orleans. All by the end of 1861, while other military efforts, that is, purely Army efforts, stalled. Confederate privateering was not as minor as many retrospective studies have proclaimed. It posed the first threat to national security because it had the potential to have presently put more hostile ships at sea than the U.S. Navy could subdue, while also striving to enforce a blockade. Similarly, it resulted in Lincoln's first proclamation of a siege, the first internationally recognized act of hostility on this part, which helped to nudge the war into international waters. It created the first Union plan for the conduct of war. Through much of the first year of the war, the government of Washington continued to regard the conflict as merely an insurrection, and that the Confederate government had no legal standing. According to the views of the Lincoln administration, the letters of marque issued by Jefferson Davis or the seceded states had no legal force, and the privateersmen who depended upon them did not symbolize a legitimate authority. Therefore, taking merchant vessels on the high sea was piracy, with the penalty of death upon conviction. The first trial for piracy was of the 13 men, including Captain Thomas H. Baker, seized on privateer Savannah. The trial was held in the United States Circuit Court for the Southern District of New York. It began on October 23, 1861, and drew wide public notice. The mere fact of the trial grew outrage in the Confederacy, where the government threatened retribution, life for life. To increase pressure on Washington, the prisoners of war who had been executed in vindication were selected and their names were made known. The trial went into jury on the 7th day, but the jury announced that it was deadlocked the next day. The prisoners were sent back to prison to await a second trial. Nevertheless, the United States government chose to no longer press the charges. The 13 men would not be regarded as pirates, but prisoners of war. They later were exchanged. The decision, as a result, meant that Washington was conceding the rights of hostility to those who took up arms against it at sea. Ship owners realized privateering was no longer worthwhile, and the practice soon died out. Some of the privateers sailed during the remainder of the war, but none had even the qualified success of Jefferson Davis. The reason for their demise was not purely economic. Privateering is defined as a decentralization of power inconsistent with technology and the modern state's evolution. It fell victim to shifts, steam-powered and gunnery in ships, more rapid communication that enabled greater central control, and the increasing hesitation of governments around to abandon power. This last one doomed privateering. The measure of the Confederate government turned from privateers to their regularly commissioned raiders, which had spectacularly more success in assailing the northern mercantile fleet. Andersonville Prison. Andersonville, or Camp Sumter, as it was known officially, held more prisoners at any given time than any other Confederate military prisons. It was built in early 1864 after Confederate officials determined to move many federal prisoners in and around Richmond to a place of greater security and ample food. During the 14 months it existed, more than 45,000 Union soldiers were imprisoned there. Of these, nearly 13,000 died from illness, poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, or exposure to the elements. Confederates widened the cells in late June 1864. The prison pen was enclosed by a partition of felled pine logs varying in height from 15 to 17 feet. Sentry boxes, called pigeon roasts by the prisoners, stood at 90-foot breaks along the top of the enclosure, and there were 2 entrances on the west side. Inside, about 19 feet from the wall, was the dead line, which prisoners were prohibited from crossing. The dead line was intended to discourage prisoners from climbing over the enclosure or tunneling under it. It was denoted by a simple post and a rail fence. The guards had ordered to shoot any prisoner crossing the wall or reaching it. A branch of Sweetwater Creek, called Stockade Branch, flowed through the prison yard. It was the only source of water for most of the prison. In an emergency, 8 small earthen forts outside the prison could hold artillery to put down troubles within the compound and protect against Union cavalry raids. The Confederate government could not supply sufficient housing, food, clothing, or medical care to the federal captives being held because of worsening economic circumstances in the South, a poor transportation system, and the desperate need for the Confederate Army for food and supplies. The first prisoners were brought to Andersonville in late February 1864. During the first few months, approximately 400 more arrived each day. By June, 26,000 men were penned in an area initially meant for only 10,000 prisoners. The most significant number held at any time was more than 33,000 in August 1864. These conditions, along with the deterioration of the prisoner exchange system between the North and South, caused much misery and a high mortality rate. There is so much filth about the camp that it is terrifying trying to live here. One prisoner, a Michigan cavalry, John Ransom, confided in his diary. He continues, "With sunken eyes, blackened countenances from pitch, pine smoke, rags, and disease, the men look sickening. The air reeks with nastiness." Still, another prisoner remembered, "Since I was born, I never saw such misery." When General William T. Sherman's Union forces occupied Atlanta, Georgia on September 2, 1864, bringing Federal cavalry columns within striking distance of Andersonville, Confederate leaders moved most prisoners to other South Carolina and coastal Georgia camps. From then until April 1865, Andersonville worked in a smaller capacity. When the war finished, Captain Henry Wirz, the prisoners' commandant, was arrested and charged with plotting with Confederate officials to impair and injure the health and destroy the lives of federal prisoners, and murder in violation of the laws of war. Such a scheme never existed, but public anger and bitterness throughout the North over the conditions at Andersonville required appeasement. Tried and found guilty by a military tribunal, Wirz was hanged in Washington, D.C. on November 10, 1865. Wirz was the only person executed for war crimes during the Civil War. Andersonville Prison ceased to exist when the war ended in April 1865. Some former prisoners stayed in federal service, but most returned to their civilian careers before the war. During July and August 1865, Clara Barton, a detachment of laborers and soldiers, and former prisoner Dorrance Atwater came to Andersonville Cemetery to remember and mark the graves of the Union dead. As a prisoner at Andersonville, Atwater had been assigned to record the names of deceased Union soldiers for Confederate prison officials. Fearing the loss of the death records at the war's end, Atwater made his copy of the records in hope of informing the relatives of the more than 12,000 dead interred at Andersonville. Thanks to Atwater's list and the Confederate death records apprehended at the war's end, only 460 of the Andersonville graves had to be labeled Unknown U.S. Soldier. Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the initial Emancipation Proclamation, which announced that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the states presently engaged in rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforth forever free. Lincoln didn't free all the roughly 4 million men, women, and children held in slavery in the United States when he signed the formal Emancipation Proclamation in January. The document involved only enslaved people in the Confederacy and not those in the border states that stayed loyal to the Union. But although it was presented primarily as a military action, the proclamation marked a significant change in Lincoln's views on slavery. Emancipation would be redefined the Civil War, turning it from a battle to maintain the Union to one concentrated on ending slavery. It would set an assertive course of how the proclamation reshaped the nation after that historic descent. Sectional pressures over slavery in the United States had been building for decades by 1854 when Congress's passage of the Nebraska-Kansas Act opened territory that had one time been closed to slavery according to the Missouri Compromise. Resistance to the act led to the appearance of the Republican Party in 1854. It restored the failing political career of an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who rose from anonymity to national stature and claimed the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. Lincoln personally despised slavery and believed it debased. Quote, "If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another," he said in a now famous oration in Peoria, Illinois, in 1854. But Lincoln didn't think the Constitution gave the federal government the power to abolish it in the states where it already existed, only to stop its establishment in western territories that would ultimately become states. In his first inaugural address in early 1861, he stated that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists. By that time, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, creating the Confederate States of America and setting the stage for the Civil War. At the outset of the conflict, Lincoln urged that the war was not about freeing enslaved people in the South, but about maintaining the Union. 4 border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri stayed on the Union side, and many others in the North also resisted abolition. When one of his generals, John C. Fremont, put Missouri under martial law, stating that the Confederate supporters would have their property confiscated and officials would free their enslaved people, Lincoln ushered him to reverse that approach and later released him from command. But hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children fled to Union-controlled South areas, such as Fortress Monroe in Virginia, where General Benjamin F. Butler had declared them contraband of war, defying the fugitive slave law, demanding their return to their owners. Abolitionists argued that freeing enslaved people in the South would help the Union win the war, as enslaved labor was vital to the Confederate war effort. In July 1862, Congress enacted the Militia Act, which allowed black men to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces as laborers, and the Confiscation Act, which directed that enslaved people seized from the Confederate supporters would be declared forever free. With little success, Lincoln tried to get the border states to agree to incremental emancipation, including recompense to enslavers. When abolitionists rebuked him for not coming out with a more decisive emancipation policy, Lincoln responded that he cherished saving the Union over all else. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or to destroy slavery, he wrote in an editorial published in 1862. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. But I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. At the same time, however, Lincoln's cabinet pondered over the document that would become the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had written a draft in late July. While some of his counsels defended it, others were apprehensive. William H. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, advised the president to wait to declare emancipation until the Union won a significant victory on the battlefield, and Lincoln took his guidance. On September 17, 1862, Union troops suspended the advance of Confederate forces led by General Robert E. Lee near Sharpsburg, Maryland, in the Battle of Antietam. Days later, Lincoln went public with a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which called on all Confederate states to rejoin the Union within 100 days, by January 1, 1863, or their slaves would be declared thenceforward and forever free. On January 1st, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which included nothing about gradual emancipation, payment for enslavers, or black immigration or colonization, an approach Lincoln kept in the past. Exempt from the proclamation were the 4 border slave states and all or parts of the 3 Confederate states controlled by the Union Army. Lincoln justified freedom as a wartime measure and was careful to apply only to Confederate states currently in rebellion. As Lincoln's decree applied only to territory beyond his control, the Emancipation Proclamation had little genuine effect on freeing any of the nation's enslaved people. But its metaphoric power was tremendous, as it proclaimed freedom for enslaved people as one of the North's war aims, alongside maintaining the Union itself. It also had practical effects. Nations like Britain and France, which had formerly believed defending the Confederacy to expand their power and influence, backed off due to their firm resistance to slavery. Black Americans were allowed to serve in the Union Army for the first time, and nearly 200,000 would do so by the war's end. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for an endless nullification of slavery in the United States. As Lincoln and his allies in Congress recognized emancipation would have no constitutional grounds after the war ended, they soon began working to legislate a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. By 1865, both the houses of Congress had passed the 13th Amendment, ratifying it that December. It is my greatest and most enduring contribution to the history of the war, Lincoln said of emancipation in February 1865, 2 months before his assassination. It is, in fact, the central act of my administration and the great event of the 19th century.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.